Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in December of 2024, and there were quite a few of them. I had 2 weeks off from work over this winter break, and so I definitely filled a lot of that time with reading. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first book that I read of the month was the third book in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. It is called Assassin's Quest. This is actually one of the 24 books I wanted to read in 2024. It was a series, a trilogy, and it's basically about this character who is the bastard son of a prince, and he comes to live in this castle and he becomes trained as an assassin. There is a ton of movement from book 1 to book 3 in terms of what happened, so it's very hard to talk about book 3 without giving away spoilers. But I will say that if you enjoy fantasy novels, I would absolutely pick up Robin Hobb. This is considered one of the entry trilogies into the worlds that she's building, and I really did enjoy this one. Okay, next up I picked up The Winter Quartet by Elin Hilderbrand, and this is made up of 4 books, Winter Street, Winter Stroll, Winter Storms, and Winter Solstice. And it basically follows the storylines of multiple family members who own a bed and breakfast. And the characters are kind of like the parents who are now divorced. The father has remarried, the mother has not remarried, and then they have all these kids, and the kids have various relationship issues and challenges. There's somebody who goes to prison at one point. There's somebody who has a cancer diagnosis at some point, a lot of just family drama. Very quick reads. I think these were all roughly about 250 pages. So the audiobooks were very fast. And I think that Elin Hilderbrand, from what I understand, people really enjoy kind of the interconnected nature of her stories and kind of how she weaves all these things in together. I would say that there wasn't anything that really stood out about these to me. It wasn't I immediately wanted to go out and read all of her other books, but they were solid stories, solid character development, and I did enjoy them. I also picked up over the course of the month all of the books in the Crowns of Nyaxia series by Carissa Broadbent. And I started with a novella called Six Scorched Roses, which is basically set in the world, but not super tied to any of the main characters of the books. Then I reread The Serpent and the Wings of Night, and I reread The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, and then I read for the first time The Songbird and the Heart of Stone. And I basically read all of these back to back because there are a lot of detail, a lot of interconnected characters, and I will say that the first book focuses on a female main character who has to go through a series of trials. And in this series of trials, she kind of forms this partnership with a male main character who's a vampire. This is kind of set in a vampire subgenre of fantasy. And in the second book, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it basically continues the storyline of this female main character and this male vampire. And there is a third character who is kind of connected to the male vampire. She's a female vampire, and they're kind of almost like siblings. They're not biological siblings, but they basically take care of each other and they care about each other. And the third full book in the series, The Songbird and the Heart of Stone, is basically a storyline of this third character where she basically goes into the underworld and has to have her own kind of challenges and things that she's dealing with. I really liked the direction that this took. I thought it was a really interesting departure from the kind of story arc that we were seeing in books 1 and 2. And so I would definitely recommend the series. I have found it to be really interesting. Okay, then I picked up a couple of books that were my alphabet challenge books. So I had the letter B in December. And the first book is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is a book that is set in Tokyo, and there is a coffee shop where people can sit in a particular chair and kind of follow a number of rules, and they get to go back in time and interact with someone from their past, basically. And there are a number of different interconnected stories about that. I think there's five different characters that kind of choose to do this, and they do it for different reasons. I will say that, Japanese literature is different. It just has a different tone. It has a different pacing. I always enjoy it. I probably should read more of it. But I would recommend this. I think it's one of those books that you could absolutely kind of sit in a coffee shop and get yourself kind of lost in. Then I picked up a book by Ross Gay called The Book of Delights, Essays. And these are basically short essays about things that delight the author. And I thought it was really fun. I listened to this on audio, and I think it was read by the author, which I also really enjoyed. And, you know, in a time when anything that is delightful or bringing you kind of joy or bright spots in your life, you know, it sometimes can be hard to find those things. And it was really fun to see this book of essays. Then I picked up a book called A Redbird Christmas by Fannie Flagg. And Fannie Flagg is probably most known for Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe, which was made into a film. But she has written other books as well. And I just find her style to be incredibly charming. And she has this like very distinct tone in what she writes. And if you like it, you would probably like everything that she does. If you don't like it, she's probably not for you. Like, I feel like she's one of those people that has a very specific brand of writing. And a lot of her books are set in the South. So there's very particular kind of themes that she's bringing in. But this one was just a really nice kind of holiday novella. And I really enjoyed kind of revisiting her writing. I hadn't read her in quite some time. Then I picked up another Alphabet Challenge book by Jason Pfeiffer called Build for Tomorrow, an action plan for embracing change, adapting fast, and future-proofing your career. While I appreciated this book, I will say it didn't really stand out to me. I read a lot of books about change, the future of work, future-proofing your career. I mean, like, this is kind of a theme of things that I read. I did find there were some like actionable and interesting things in here. If you are not steeped in that literature and you're kind of interested in it, I would definitely say that you could pick this up. Then I picked up the last book in the Sweater Weather series called Faking the Fall by Julie Christensen. And I have to even remind myself what this was about. All of these books run together for me. Okay, so this is about a actor who goes into a fake dating relationship with someone that he knew like in college. And because he's trying to kind of like save his reputation, basically. And I would say of the 7 that I read, this one was not my favorite, but it probably fell somewhere in the middle in terms of just kind of like what was interesting about it and what I appreciated about the character development. Then I picked up 12th Night. This is by Alexine Farrell-Falmuth, which I feel like I said I had not read this person before, but then when I looked, no, I have not read this person before. Okay, so this is basically a young adult novel about, oh, no, I'm reminding myself that I was wrong. So I have read this person before. This is the person who wrote the Atlas 6, which I did read, and it's kind of a dark academia fantasy novel. This is much more kind of straight up YA romance. It's set in a high school. It's about a couple people who are gamers, basically, if that's kind of a subculture that's of interest to you. I did enjoy this book. And I feel like there are other YA authors that I tend to gravitate more, you know, a little bit more than this particular author, but I would pick up something else by this author in the future. Then I picked up The Brothers Hawthorne. This is the 4th book in the Inheritance Game series by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I will say that this book was a very entertaining evening for me as I put together multiple pieces of shelving furniture that I installed into my living room. And so this was actually, I appreciated this. I appreciated having this, and I basically spent multiple hours binge reading this while I was putting together furniture. It continues the story of the Hawthorne brothers, and they're basically kind of like adopted sibling who is somebody who got the inheritance of their grandfather, and they didn't know who this person was, and this all kind of unfolds in book 1. So when we're in book 4, they have established relationships with each other, you know, between these brothers and this girl who's kind of come into their life. And you see a lot more of the brothers, their familial relationships with different characters throughout this particular book. I really like the world that this author has built. I think it's a really interesting set of stories that she's creating, and I would definitely read another book. I think this was meant to be a trilogy, and she added on a book 4. I think there's also a book 5 that is either out already or coming out soon. Okay, then I read the 4th book in the Red Rising saga. This is by Pierce Brown. The 4th book is called Iron Gold. I am kind of sorry to say this is where I decided to end reading this series. There are 6 books that are currently out. The first 3 kind of stand alone in their own trilogy, and then there's like a jump in the timeline basically, and then the next set of books begins. And I read the trilogy and I appreciated it. It's very well done. It's very interesting. Well, I can tell that it will be interesting to a particular kind of audience. I don't think I am that audience. It's very political. It's very focused on kind of like war and fighting and factions and, you know, all these different kinds of things. And I can tell that it's good. It's just not for me. And so I thought, well, let me read the fourth one, see if I can kind of get into it. I just really struggled to connect with any characters, to really feel like I could follow along with what was going on. And I did go online and try to understand the fourth book. You know, I looked at some like wikis on it, and people were like, this is super confusing. Like, I was not the only one who was kind of struggling with understanding what was going on. So I decided to kind of pause there and not push myself to continue to read in this series, because I read 4 very chunky books of the 6 and I just wasn't getting there. So I decided to set that one aside. Then I picked up a book called Heartless by Marissa Meyer. This is a kind of not a retelling, a kind of prequel telling of the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland, and kind of her history and early days of like childhood into adolescence and adulthood, and like why basically she became the Queen of Hearts. I will say that I'm not a huge Alice in Wonderland fan. You know, like if you love Alice in Wonderland, you would love this book. There are a lot of details that she's bringing in from Alice in Wonderland that are very fun. And the little I know about Alice in Wonderland, which I don't think I've read, I think I've just watched like the children's film. The little I know of like the little bits and pieces from it, I could see how she was weaving it in. And I think it's very, very smartly done. I was entertained by the book. I think this is very much though a book for people who are like deep fans of this work, which I wouldn't put myself in that category, but I still feel like it was really good. Okay, then I picked up the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen series. It is called Malice by John Gwynne. And this is a series that had been highly, highly, highly recommended. There are 4 books in the series, and I was very excited to dive into this. And then I read the first book and I could not follow anything that was going on. And I just didn't really care about any of the characters. And so I went online and I started to poke around of like, what are people really saying about this series? Should I continue? You know, like, is this something I want to force myself to do? Kind of like the Red Rising, you know, like, is this just not for me? Basically, it was a lot of fighting and war and politicking. And I'm starting to realize that just may not be something that I'm interested in, you know, in these kinds of series. But I had heard, you know, such good things. And so I was, you know, poking around. And basically what someone said was, you know, here's the pros and here's the cons. And all of the cons I agreed with. I was like, yep, totally get that. You know, like I would agree. Those are the things that are kind of a problem for me. And then all of the pros, like none of them were things that I could identify. They're like, oh, I'm just like rooting for these characters. And I was like, I am not rooting for anyone. Like I'm just not connected to these characters. And so this was another series that I decided to set aside. Now, I will say throughout the entire year of 2024, I do not think I DNF'd, did not finish any of the books I put on my list. But as we got closer and closer to the end of the year, and I had so many things I wanted to read, I was like, you know what? I'm not forcing myself to do this. So you can set aside things that are not working for you. And this is one of those series that unfortunately didn't quite work for me. Okay, so then I did pick up something else that I was very excited about, which is the 19th book in the Chief Inspector Armand Gamache series by Louise Penny. It is called The Great Wolf. A couple years back, I think, I read the entire series of this Armand Gamache series. He's basically a police officer, and he is in a small town in Canada. There are various mysteries throughout the series. The first book is called Still Life. And I basically went back to the beginning and read the entire thing so that I could kind of follow the arc of what was happening throughout the entire series. I love this series. It definitely has this very consistent feeling about it in terms of how she's setting up this small town, the different characters in the small town, the relationships, the familial relationships, the found family relationships. There's a lot of ups and downs throughout the series. So I'm not going to go into anything about the specifics of the plot of this book because there are many things that kind of like thematically ties back to in earlier parts of the series, but it was a solid addition to the series and I enjoyed that. Then I picked up a book called Madwoman by Chelsea Beaker, I think is how it's pronounced. And this is basically about a woman who we find out, I think relatively early in the novel, that her mother is in prison. And her mother is in prison. I hope this is not a spoiler. I think we know this, that her mother killed her father. And so she is kind of having trauma and kind of still dealing with that as an adult. She has her own child now. She's married. And this woman comes into her life, like a friend that she works with basically. And they start to have this like relationship, not a romantic relationship, but kind of like an intense relationship. And you can tell that she's kind of like unraveling a little bit throughout this book, hence the title, maybe Madwoman. And I will say there was a reveal that happened, I don't know, maybe 75%, 80% of the way in, that I was like, that was, I think it was meant to be a reveal, but it was like obvious to me throughout the entire book. I was like, oh, this is what this is. Like, I mean, it was just like from page 1, I was like, yep, I'm pretty sure this is what's going on. So I don't know if it was supposed to be a reveal or if we were supposed to understand it. I'm not going to say what it is here because it would be maybe a spoiler for some of you. So I would say it was okay. I mean, I have a hard time placing this in terms of genre because I think it was meant to be a little bit of like a mystery thriller, but not quite, even though there's like elements of it there. But I've heard other people who really, really enjoyed this one. So I think it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. The next book that I read, which I had kind of picked up and was reading throughout the month, is a book called Bibliophile, an illustrated miscellany by Jane Mount. And this is basically a book that has little bits and bobs about all kinds of things that are literary. It talks about bookstores around the world. It talks about different kinds of book lists of things you might want to be reading. It talks about different authors. It was really fun. And she kind of like puts little illustrations and things throughout this book. And it actually didn't take, it was like 900 pages long. It didn't take that long for me to read it because it was just like little snippets of text and a lot of illustrations in between. But it was very enjoyable. So this would be a good like gift book for a reader in your life. Okay, next up I picked up Wicked. And this is the first book in the Wicked Years series by Gregory Maguire. Obviously the Broadway musical and the film is based off of this book. And there are several other books in this series. And what I had heard about this book was that the musical and the film are different than the book itself. Like there are clear departures. And I wanted to read the book because if I ever, watch the musical or the film, I wanted to be able to see how they were adapting it. The other thing I had heard is that the book is significantly spicier than the musical and the film. Having not seen the musical and the film, I don't know, but yes, the book has spicy elements to it that I thought were kind of interesting in terms of just like the tone that the author was taking with this story. The most interesting thing to me is actually not this book. It was fine. I mean, I think I'm not like a Wizard of Oz person, similar to like I'm not an Alice in Wonderland person. And so like these kinds of things that are adapting from that, like it doesn't have strong resonance with me. However, I did do a deeper dive on the original Wizard of Oz books, of which there are like 40, and they were authored by many, many, many different people over a long period of time. And I just had no idea that there was that kind of canon that Gregory Maguire would be able to draw from. So that concept is like fascinating to me, that there's this huge canon of Wizard of Oz books, that they were written by all of these different people, and that Gregory Maguire is kind of like continuing this very long chain of that story. That's interesting. But the story itself, I will say, it was fine. I mean, I don't know that I would recommend it to anyone who's like really into the musical and the film. I think if you're getting what you need out of that, you're probably fine without reading the book. Okay, then I picked up a book called What Happened to Nina by Dervla McTiernan. And this is a book that somebody on social media said they got completely sucked into, and they were just like turning the pages. And anytime I get that kind of recommendation, I'm totally willing to pick it up. This is basically the story of a late teens, early 20s. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's early 20s. A woman who is dating this guy, and they go away for a weekend together, like to a cabin, and he returns and she is not with him. And her parents are like, where is she? And they can't find her, and they think something has happened, and you're not sure if something has happened. And you have a little bit of an inkling from early on in the book, this is not a spoiler, that their relationship was not great. Like there were some things there that were a little bit questionable in terms of like how he treated her and things like that. But then the book takes all of these like really fun twists and turns. I can see why it's kind of that page turner of what has happened to Nina and what her parents are dealing with as they're going through this situation where she's missing. the parents of the boyfriend are like trying to protect him. They're kind of wealthy and they're trying to, you know, make sure that he is not getting like railroaded by the police and like all these different kinds of things. And the ending is super fun. So I would definitely recommend that one. The next book I picked up is called Look in the Mirror. This is by Catherine Steadman. I can officially say I will pretty much read anything that Catherine Steadman writes at this point. I have read multiple of her books. I have enjoyed every single one. And some of them are a little bit convoluted. They get a little bit twisty and turny to the point where you're like, what exactly is going on here? But I kind of enjoy it. And I find that her premises of her books, I'm just like totally sucked in. So this basic premise of this is you have like two different kind of storylines you're following. One is of this woman whose father has died, and she gets notified that he has this property on this like random island that she had no idea that he had, and she has now inherited it, and she has to go to this property and like figure out what's going on. So that's kind of interesting. Then you have this other storyline of this woman who's been hired as a nanny at this property, and the kids and the father are supposed to like come and meet her there, and they haven't shown up. And she's been hired by like an agency basically. And so she calls the agency and they're like, yep, they're on their way. They'll be there eventually. You know, hang out in the house. Everything's fine. Just don't go into the basement room. And so of course this woman is like, well, now I want to go into the basement room because I've been told I can't go in there. What's going on in this basement room? And so these storylines eventually kind of merge in a particular kind of way where you understand, and it gets pretty convoluted in the end. But I mean, isn't that such an interesting premise of like what's going on with these houses and these women and like, you know, the basement room that you're not supposed to go into? What's in there? Like, I'm always interested in those kinds of storylines. So I will continue to read Catherine Steadman because I think she's fantastic. Okay, then I finally read The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is the first book in the Hierarchy series. I've been trying to read this book for a very long time and have not been able to get to it because it's very long. And it's one of those books that you kind of need to read carefully, I will say. So when I'm listening to the audio, I'm also reading the text. Like I had to do both at the same time to make sure I was really understanding what was going on. It has kind of like a Greek-Roman underpinning to it. Like it's got like some themes that are kind of coming out of that. It's basically about a boy, he's kind of a teenager who goes to this school and he's there to kind of be disruptive. He's actually been kind of like implanted there by this other person. I'm not going to go into all the details of why, but you learn relatively early in the book. And he is there to solve kind of a mystery of a murder and is trying to understand what's going on. There are definitely parts of this book that I will say, I don't think you're supposed to fully understand. And when you get to the end, like even like the last page, you're like, oh, like you just want to dive into book 2 because you're like, where is this going? Like there's a lot to unravel. And you could probably go back and read. This is one of those books you could go back and read from the beginning if you had time to read a 600-page book twice, which I did not choose to do this month. But I enjoyed the level of detail. I enjoyed the plotting. I thought it was really creative. So I would definitely pick up a second book in this series. This is also one of those books that I immediately was like asking my partner to read so that I could talk with him about it. Because I was like, I don't feel like I fully understood everything that was going on. And he's very good with like world building and understanding all of that. So I may force him to read 600 pages so that we can talk about it. All right, the next couple of books I picked up were the 2 books in the King Siblings series by Lucy Score. The first one is called Mr. Fixer-Upper, and the second one is called The Christmas Fix. I read the first one to get to the second one because it is Christmas themed, and I wanted to have another holiday book on my pile. And what I will say is they are set in this like DIY world where people have like a TV show where they're filming about DIY. There is another book that Lucy Score has written that is a similar DIY TV show theme, but different characters. What was fun about this 2-book set, I appreciated the second book more, probably because it was holiday themed and just given the time of the year. But it was basically about this woman who goes to this town and she's trying to film something in this town, and the town manager is like very grumpy. It was a very kind of like Hallmark movie feel of the second book, which I thought was kind of a fun, I I don't know, just a tone that I appreciated this time of year. So I've always enjoyed Lucy Score. I think sometimes her side characters make the books even better than sometimes the main characters, and I would definitely pick up more from her in the future. Okay, then I picked up a bunch of random books that were going to expire either on my library holds or on Audible Premium, and I had them on my list and I wanted to get to them just to see what they were like. So these were just kind of random things that came onto my radar. The first one is a book called The Falling by Anna Todd. It is the first book in the Brightest Stars series. This is a slow burn, I would say it's like a new adult romance, which is basically like a step beyond YA, where there's basically this girl who is living on a like army base, I think, and she is encountering all these different people who are in the army, and there is a boy man that she engages with, and they have this kind of like slow burn romance. He is clearly a little bit damaged, you know, trying to deal with some trauma. And there's a bit of a reveal at the end of the book that I think, who knows where it's going in the rest of the series. I'm a little bit unclear. I feel like this book, while interesting, like I didn't feel a strong need to continue. I was like, okay, I kind of got what I needed from that. I understand where this author is going. I understand generally what she writes about. I had never read Anna Todd before and have seen her kind of floating around in different places and spaces. And so glad I picked it up, but not sure I'll continue with the series. Then I picked up a book called The Bishop's Wife. This is the first book in the Linda Walheim mystery series by Met Ivy Harrison. Never read this author before. What intrigued me about this series is that it's set in the Mormon community. And so The Bishop's Wife is literally the wife of a bishop in the Mormon church. And basically what happens in this book is there is a woman who goes missing and she leaves behind a husband and a young child. And the bishop's wife is concerned that something has happened to her. And she becomes kind of this amateur detective. I'm kind of a sucker for amateur detective mystery novels, particularly ones that I think are set in like a very interesting setting, like the Amish community or the Mormon community, or like there's something that's kind of not like a cozy mystery about it, but there's clearly like a cultural aspect that's being brought into the books. Now, I think it's important to say, when I went and looked at reviews of this book, there were a lot of readers who were coming from a background of Mormonism who did not like how Mormonism was portrayed in this book. The author is from a Mormon background, from what I understand. I don't know if she is still a practicing Mormon or not, but there were specific concerns about things that were brought up in this book where they were like, oh, they make all Mormons sound like they're killing people and they're pedophiles and, you know, they have all these things going on. And it reminded me a little bit of, I'm not going to remember what it's called, Midsummer Murders. If you've ever watched the television show Midsummer Murders, and it's like every time you turn around in this small community, there's another murder, and it's like very strange, and it goes on for 20 seasons, and there's all of these murders. And I felt like some of the people who were like feeling negatively about this were like, oh my gosh, like look at all these murders that are happening. And I was like, well, it's a mystery novel series. Like, yeah, you're going to have stuff that's like intrigue, you know, like she has to come up with things that it's not meant to represent the entire community, but it's going to be an overabundance of things that are showing up in a particular book. I would be kind of intrigued to continue reading in this series to see what I think, just because I thought the main character was kind of charming. Other reviewers did note that she did some stuff that seemed kind of stupid, and I was like, well, amateur detectives tend to do that. So I feel like reading in this subgenre, which I have in the past, I was okay with it. I didn't have as much critique of this as what I saw some other people critiquing, and I might continue to read in the series. All right, next up I read a book called Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I don't know that I have read an R.F. Kuang before. Let me check and see if that is actually true. I have read an R.F. Kuang. So the book that I read by R.F. Kuang in the past was called The Poppy War. I read this several years ago. Very different than Yellowface. So R.F. Kuang is also known for Babel, or Babel, not quite sure how it's pronounced, which I have not read, but it's on my eventual to read pile. And this is an author who, The Poppy War is like deep fantasy. I mean, it is not contemporary. It is set in like another world. Well, not another world. I guess what I want to differentiate is Yellowface is like contemporary New York publishing world. The Poppy War is like a very separate time and space where there are historical events and things that are happening that are not real. In Yellowface, it is very much set in kind of today. And basically the storyline is this woman who is good friends with another author. They're both writers. And the friend dies and she steals her manuscript and presents it as her own. It sounds relatively simple in terms of kind of like how this is going to play out. And I will say for a period of time, I kind of resisted reading this book. I heard so many good things about it, but I was like, I don't really know that this is going to be, you know, like what's the big deal kind of thing about this book. This book was brilliant. I mean, I cannot say enough good things about it. I think R.F. Kuang so deftly handles a number of issues in this book, including kind of like cultural takeover and like what that looks like in the publishing world, and just the way that she can write things like the Poppy War and then write things like Yellowface. I was like, this is a brilliant person. I'm just completely sucked in. So I will absolutely add more books by this author onto my to read pile. I would highly recommend Yellowface. I'm really interested to see if R.F. Kuang continues to write books that are a little bit more contemporary, because what I'm used to from this author is stuff that's more in the fantasy realm. Okay, next up, I read The True Love Experiment by Christina Lauren. Christina Lauren is a partnered authorship. It is two women who write together under that name. And this is a story that continues it is part of a duology, basically, called the DNA Duo. The first book is called The Soulmate Equation, and then the second love is True Love Experiment. I had read The Soulmate Equation. I did not realize these were linked until I started reading this one. And then I was like, oh, okay, I see. There are character overlaps, there's theme overlaps. In The Soulmate Equation, it's basically this concept of DNA can tell you who you're supposed to be partnered with. And that continues in The True Love Experiment. But it's basically about this guy who's producing a reality TV show. And he asked this woman who's like a very famous romance author to be like the Bachelorette in this romance reality TV show. And then they start to have like a bit of a romance themselves. They're kind of falling for each other. This was super smart. It was really interesting, like the structure of it and like how it brought in reality TV, which I am not a huge reality TV fan, but the way it was used in this particular book was really, really interesting. So yeah, I am looking forward to more Christina Lauren. I would definitely pick up more in the future. The next book I picked up is called Lynchpin by Seth Godin. I have a huge pile of Seth Godin books that I'm going to be eventually working my way through. If you are unfamiliar with Seth Godin, he is very well known as like an entrepreneur and a marketer. He runs a program that's like an informal MBA program for people. He is like a thought leader, you know, in this space, and he often writes these books of essays. This one is basically talking about how like capitalism is set up in such a way that there's like cogs in a wheel, and he's basically making an argument that you have to kind of step outside of that system to become a linchpin, which is basically someone who is like creative and problem solving and able to do more than just kind of the typical person. But he's acknowledging the risk that that takes to kind of like set yourself apart of being like that creative problem solving person. I had read this book before, but I wanted to revisit it. And I will say that I like the concept of it. It didn't really blow me away. There are other things he's written that I've taken a lot more from. But if that intrigues you, you could definitely pick it up. Then I read the third book in the Sparrow Falls series. It is called Broken Harbor by Catherine Cowles. Catherine Cowles writes small town romance, oftentimes romance suspense. And that is what this book was. It is the third book in the series, so it follows the third sibling of an interconnected group of like adopted siblings. Basically, they're like fostered together. And the male main character is like a famous hockey player. The female main character is a woman who has been running from a partner who's like a former partner who's like an addict and has been trying to track her down. And of course, the hockey player, wants to be protective and to kind of help her out of the situation. I would say of the three books, this one was not necessarily a favorite, but I do like the interconnected storylines. I wanted to see more of the siblings because I really appreciate that found family piece of the series. And it didn't come out as much in this book as it has in the others. But I would definitely pick up the fourth book in the series when it comes out. All right, a few more. So I also read Dyslexia, A Very Short Introduction by Margaret Snowling. I think I have mentioned, in many other videos that I'm doing a deeper dive on neurodiversity. I am teaching a class starting in January about coaching neurodiverse clients. And I have done a deeper dive on ADHD and autism, but not on dyslexia. And so I've been starting to do more reading in that area in partial preparation for teaching this class. And this book, if you're familiar with A Very Short Introduction series, I mean, this is a series of books that covers all kinds of topics. I encountered it first, I think, as an undergrad. So it's a little bit more of an academic lens. She definitely talks about studies that have been done on dyslexia. It is coming from more of a researcher perspective. But I kind of appreciated that. I didn't mind that. I just think that if you are more of a non-academic reader, it might be something that you might look for a different introduction, to this topic. Okay, then I picked up Kathy Reich's 23rd Temperance Brennan book called Fire and Bones. If you are familiar with the TV show Bones, this is the book series that it is based off of. And actually in this book, there is a shout out to the Bones TV series, which I thought was kind of funny. These books, because it's such a long running series, the plot is almost just not like, I feel like I always say like the plot is not really worth mentioning in these long running series, but what I will say is it was a solid addition to this series. What I really like about Kathy Reichs is there's a little bit of like predictableness to how she kind of frames her plots. For example, there's always a point in the novel where Temperance Brennan is like, my subconscious is like tickling my brain. Like I should know something, but I'm not remembering what I should know. And that's like the thing that unlocks the mystery. I mean, this happens in almost every single book. And there's just, I appreciate that kind of like familiarity and a little bit of consistency as you're going throughout the series. But I will continue to read this series. I just really appreciate the tone of Temperance Brennan and also kind of the science that Kathy Reichs brings into the books as well. Then I picked up Now Is Not the Time to Panic by Kevin Wilson. This is a book that I had on my radar for quite some time, in part just because of the title and also the cover. I had seen different covers of it that were intriguing to me. And a relatively short book, so I went ahead and picked it up toward the end of this month. And it is basically the story of these two teenagers that create this poster, and they start putting this poster around town, and they basically create this like panic. And then that panic spreads to like other cities, and it's all because of this like art piece that they made and started producing. And then the woman pairing, it's a boy and a girl, teenagers. The woman, as she grows older, she has her own family, and this journalist basically tracks her down and says, I know this was you, and I want to know more about this. Like, because nobody knows like where the origin of this was from, and she's never told anyone. And so this person like tracks her down, and so it kind of alternates in terms of timeline between when she was a teenager and now that she's an adult, and what she's going to do about this fact that this person found out, that she's this originator of this poster. And there are details in the story that I won't give away as to like why that feels difficult for her. But it's basically about art. It's about relationships. It's about culture. A lot of like interesting literary themes that I did end up really enjoying. Next up, I read the first book in the Calamity Montana series by Devney Perry. It is called The Bribe, and I am realizing that Devney Perry has a theme where she likes to have a female main character in peril and a male main character who is a sheriff. This is the very common theme that is coming up in many of her series, and that is true of this case as well. There is a woman who is a kind of runaway country singer star, and she goes to this small town in Montana and becomes embroiled in a relationship with the sheriff, and they continue on from there. It was a relatively quick read, and I will continue to read the books in this series. I think this was actually one of her first series because it was published under a different name, and then now she's kind of like merged all of those earlier publications under the name she uses now, which is Devney Perry. Okay, the last book that I read in the month of January is one called, or in the month of December, rather, we're almost to January, is a book called If It Makes You Happy by Julie Olivia. I loved this book. This is a book that was meant to have this like 90s rom-com vibe, and she totally pulls it off. I mean, it is absolutely there. I was completely sucked in. It's like roughly 500 pages. It's basically about this woman whose mother dies, and her mother ran this like not Airbnb, like a bed and breakfast inn. Airbnb did not exist when this book is set. And she needs to go and like run this bed and breakfast while her younger sister, who's going to come take it over, she's like in art school and she's like finishing out art school. And so she takes like a leave from her job to go run this bed and breakfast. And there's a neighbor who it was like close with the mother. He's got a couple of young girls. He's divorced, and he was close friends with like her parents, you know, when they were running this bed and breakfast. And of course they start to like have a little bit of a friendship, a relationship that begins to blossom into a romance. And the woman who's running the bed and breakfast is also divorced, recently divorced. And the thing that I appreciate about these romances that are a little bit more toward like, I won't even say midlife, because I think she's meant to be like in her late 20s, early 30s. It's just people have baggage, and it's just real. You know, like it was a very real romance of like, she kind of had stories in her own head about like what she was worthy of and what she wasn't worthy of. And the male main character is the same. Like he has his own baggage from his divorce and kind of his situation. And I just found myself really rooting for them and like wanting them to make it work. And it was one of those, you know, it was very cinematic. Like I could absolutely see it being made into a film. And it reminded me a little bit, it has kind of a tone of like, and I don't even know how I would describe this as to why, but it reminded me a little bit of like The Family Stone, if you're familiar with that, which is basically about this like sprawling house and all of the people who are in this house and the drama that they're kind of trying to figure out together. And you could just imagine this bed and breakfast as like being this like large house, and there's the house next door with this neighbor, and they're kind of going back and forth between each other's houses and trying to figure things out. Like there's a very visual component to what she was putting together that it made it very real, you know, as you were kind of reading the book. So a ton of good reading in December of 2024, and I'm really looking forward to diving into January as well. So keep an eye out for my January TBR video. Make sure to drop into the comments below the video what you have read in December that you want me to add to my pile as well. I would love to hear. And until the next video, happy reading.